In Weimar, Germany, during November of the year 1923, a single loaf of bread commanded a price of 200 billion marks. Your entire life savings, if held in that currency, would have purchased absolutely nothing. A bank account that, in 1918, could have acquired a substantial property was by 1923 able to afford little more than bread. 5 years. That is the duration it took for a once stable currency to devolve into utterly worthless paper. However, some individuals managed to weather the storm. Some even prospered. This was not achieved by foreseeing the impending crisis. Instead, it was the result of adhering to fundamental guidelines that prove effective during any period of upheaval, irrespective of its origin, the affected nation, or the era. Consider Argentina in the year 2001. The peso's value was frozen. Banks shuttered their doors, rendering deposits inaccessible. The government then seized dollar accounts, converting them to pesos at an artificially manipulated exchange rate, resulting in a staggering 66% loss of savings overnight. Yet, some individuals emerged unscathed. They had followed the identical principles that had guided survivors in Weimar, Rome, and indeed during every historical collapse. Now, in America, 2025, the national debt stands at $36 trillion. The currency has diminished its purchasing power by 98% since 1913. The Federal Reserve injected $5 trillion into the economy in a mere 2-year span. The current economic trajectory mirrors precisely the patterns that have preceded every historical currency devaluation. And when this inevitable downturn occurs, whether it is 5 years from now or 15, the same enduring principles will dictate who weathers the storm and who succumbs to ruin. Presented here are 5 financial tenets that have endured every collapse throughout recorded history, an explanation of their efficacy when all else falters, specific historical precedents validating each principle, and practical applications to implement immediately before the opportunity vanishes. Grasping this knowledge is not about amassing immense wealth, it is about safeguarding what you possess. For in every crisis, the vast majority of people lose everything. This is not a consequence of their intelligence, but rather their reliance on strategies that function adequately in normal times, yet prove disastrous during periods of extreme adversity. These 5 principles were effective in Rome. They were effective in Weimar. They will be effective in America. Before we delve into these crucial principles, it is imperative to comprehend why guiding principles hold greater significance than mere strategies. A strategy is a prescriptive directive, such as acquire gold or liquidate stocks. These actions may yield positive results, or they may not. Their success is contingent upon precise timing, the unique nature of the collapse, and a multitude of variables. A principle, conversely, is an immutable truth that consistently holds its ground. Principles were operative in Rome when gold served as the medium of exchange. They remained effective in Weimar when paper currency was prevalent. They will undoubtedly function in America. Regardless of whether the collapse manifests as hyperinflation, deflation, or a complete currency recalibration, the majority of financial counsel offered is strategic. Invest in this particular stock, or allocate 60% to equities and 40% to bonds. Such strategies presume the continued functionality of the existing system. They presuppose the solvency of financial institutions, the adherence of governments to their contractual obligations, and the enforcement of property rights. During a collapse, all these presumptions crumble. However, the principles endure. Principle number 1, tangible assets withstand the test of time. Paper, however, is vulnerable to destruction. When currency disintegrates, when governments default, when the financial infrastructure fractures, physical possessions retain their inherent worth because they are real. Paper-based assets, or anything representing a claim on something else, plummet to zero as those claims become unenforceable. In Weimar, Germany, between 1918 and 1923, possessing 100,000 marks in a bank account in 1918 signified affluence. By 1923, that same sum was insufficient to purchase a single loaf of bread. The currency had been inflated into obsolescence. Paper wealth evaporated. Conversely, individuals who owned hard assets, such as land, structures, and manufacturing facilities, not only survived but often prospered. A farm in 1918 remained a farm in 1923. It continued to yield the same produce and held its intrinsic value. While the mark's value against the farm soared from 100,000 to 100 trillion, the farm itself remained unchanged. Consider Zimbabwe during the 2000s. Hyperinflation surged to an astonishing 79.6 billion% monthly in 2008. Any savings held in Zimbabwean dollars became utterly worthless. However, those who owned agricultural land, livestock, and essential equipment managed to preserve their wealth. The land continued to generate sustenance irrespective of the currency's fate. In Argentina during 2001 and 2002, the government froze bank accounts and subsequently compelled the conversion of dollar deposits to pesos at an exchange rate of 1.4 to 1. Subsequently, the peso depreciated further to 4 to 1. This exemplifies a consistent principle across three distinct crises. Tangible assets endure. Paper is susceptible to destruction. In America, in 2025, the majority of wealth is concentrated in paper-based instruments, stocks, bonds, retirement funds, and bank deposits. These are all essentially claims. A stock represents a claim on corporate profits. A bond is a claim on repayment. A bank deposit is a claim on the bank's promise to return your funds. During periods of stability, these claims are honored. However, in a collapse, the system ceases to function. Courts become overwhelmed. Banks falter. Governments renege on their obligations. Markets grind to a halt. Paper claims become worthless. Yet, tangible assets persist. Real estate remains real estate. Gold retains its inherent value. A farm continues to produce food. These assets possess intrinsic value, independent of the prevailing financial system. When the collapse occurs, paper is consumed by the flames. Tangible assets endure. Principle number 2. Prioritize ownership of productive assets over speculative ones. This distinction lies between assets that generate value and those whose worth is derived solely from the expectation that another party will offer a higher price in the future. Productive assets yield income, sustenance, or utility, independent of external opinions. Speculative assets possess value only if they can be resold. During the Great Depression, from 1929 to 1933, the stock market experienced a nosedive of 89%. Those who held stocks for speculative purposes lost nearly everything. However, individuals who directly owned productive assets, such as farms, rental properties, or businesses, continued to receive their yield. A farm provided food that could be consumed or sold. Rental properties offered essential shelter. Productive assets generate value independent of market fluctuations. A farm produces food whether the stock market is at 381 points or 41. Speculative assets are only valuable if a buyer can be found, and during a collapse, buyers are non-existent. In Venezuela during the 2000s, the stock market saw a nominal increase of 100,000%. This sounds impressive until one realizes that the bolivar had lost 99.9% of its value. However, those who owned productive assets, such as farms, bakeries, and transportation services, experienced relative prosperity. A bakery produced bread, a commodity in desperate demand. The bakery generated genuine value. Contrast this with Venezuelan government bonds. Their worth was entirely dependent on the government's willingness to honor them. The government defaulted, rendering the bonds worthless. In America in 2025, the majority of assets are speculative. The S&P 500 derives its value from the belief that it will appreciate. Bitcoin generates no tangible output. Its value stems from the expectation that others will pay more for it later. Most real estate is acquired speculatively, with the intent to flip or benefit from appreciation. Productive assets are fundamentally different. A farm that cultivates food is productive. A rental property owned outright is productive. A business that manufactures goods essential to society is productive. When collapse arrives, possess assets that generate value. A farm sustains you, speculation does not. Principle number 3, debt is a destructive force. In a collapse, even debt that was initially considered sound becomes detrimental. During periods of stability, debt can serve as leverage. One might borrow to acquire a home, which then appreciates in value, yielding a profit. However, during a collapse, all debt becomes detrimental. Your income may diminish or disappear entirely, but your debt obligations remain. The bank still demands payment. If you are unable to meet these demands, they will seize the asset. During the Great Depression, farmers had incurred debt to expand their operations throughout the 1920s, a time when land prices were on an ascent, making borrowing seem prudent. Then, 1929 arrived. Crop prices plummeted. Farm income dropped by 50 to 70%. Yet the bank debt remained unchanged. Between 1930 and 1935, over 750,000 farms were foreclosed upon. Families who had owned their land for generations lost everything due to their financial obligations. Compare this to farmers who owned their land free and clear. They faced hardships and market prices were dire, but they endured. Without the burden of debt repayment, they subsisted on the farm's produce. Debt-free farmers survived. Indebted farmers lost all. In Argentina in 2001, middle-class families held mortgages denominated in dollars. When the peso collapsed, their income in pesos fell by 66%, yet the dollar-denominated mortgage payment remained constant. Their income was reduced by 2/3, but their debt burden did not decrease. Consequently, they were unable to pay, and banks initiated foreclosures. Individuals lost homes they had been diligently paying for over a decade or even 15 years. Meanwhile, those who owned their homes outright retained possession. The crisis was identical, as was the income reduction, but the absence of debt meant no foreclosures. In Greece during the 2000s, incomes declined by 30 to 40% and pensions were cut by 50%. Yet individuals with mortgages were still obligated to pay the same amount. Default rates surged and debt proved to be their undoing. In America in 2025, Americans carry $17 trillion in household debt, encompassing $12 trillion in mortgages, $1.6 trillion in auto loans, $6 trillion in student loans, and $1 trillion in credit card debt. When the impending crisis materializes, this debt will bring about the downfall of millions of families. An opposing argument suggests that inflation benefits debtors. If you owe $300,000 and inflation reaches 20%, your debt's real value diminishes. This is accurate provided your income keeps pace with inflation. However, in genuine collapses, this is not the case. The only secure position is complete debt elimination. Own assets outright. If you possess a home with a mortgage, you do not truly own the house. You own a leveraged wager that property values will remain high and your income will stay consistent. If you own a home free and clear, you own a house, period. No bank can seize it. Debt represents leverage and an instrument for expansion. In a collapse, it becomes a pathway to ruin. Principle number 4. Skills constitute the only truly transferable form of wealth. All other forms of wealth are susceptible to confiscation. Land can be seized, gold can be confiscated, money can be devalued through inflation, and businesses can be nationalized. However, skills reside within you. They are intangible and cannot be taxed, expropriated, or eroded by inflation. During the Holocaust, Jewish families possessed property, businesses, and substantial wealth, all of which were confiscated by the Nazis. Yet the Jewish individuals who survived often owed their survival to their acquired skills. Doctors, engineers, artisans, and tailors. Individuals possessing practical skills were able to find employment. They could exchange their labor for sustenance and subsequently rebuild their lives in new countries. The affluent merchant who owned property but lacked any practical skills faced starvation. The skilled artisan who owned nothing but possessed the knowledge to build survived and contributed to reconstruction. In the Soviet Union between 1917 and 1922, the Bolsheviks seized all private property. Aristocrats who owned vast estates lost everything overnight. However, engineers, doctors, and skilled laborers retained their value. The Soviet state required their expertise, and their skills provided them with leverage, even under communist rule. The nobleman who owned 10,000 acres but was incapable of farming perished. The blacksmith, who owned nothing but could craft tools, survived. In Vietnam in 1975, as Saigon fell, millions fled. They were unable to take their property or their businesses with them. The Vietnamese refugees who achieved the greatest success in rebuilding their lives in America were those possessing valuable skills. Doctors, engineers, accountants, and mechanics arrived with nothing but their expertise. Within a single generation, they established prosperous existences. In America, in 2025, the majority of wealth is tied up in financial instruments and real estate, neither of which are easily transferable. If one needs to relocate, taking one's house is an impossibility. Furthermore, capital controls could render the removal of monetary assets impossible. Skills residing in your mind represent the sole guaranteed portable wealth. However, a significant portion of Americans lack practical, marketable skills. Can you cultivate food, repair machinery, construct shelter, or provide medical assistance? These are invaluable skills in any economic climate, whether stable or in crisis. Cultivate skills that generate value independently of complex systems. Skills form the bedrock of resilient wealth. All else is vulnerable to forfeiture. Principle number 5. Localized networks of trust endure beyond all institutional structures. When systems falter, institutions crumble, banks cease operations, governments lose their authority, law enforcement becomes ineffective, and the entire institutional framework disintegrates. Yet local networks of trusted relationships persist. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, followed by a further period of instability in 1998. The Soviet government ceased to exist, its currency became worthless, pensions were halted, and supply chains fractured, leading to empty grocery stores. Russians survived through the strength of their local networks. Families pooled their resources. Neighbors engaged in mutual exchange. Communities organized their own security and shared essential provisions. Those who fared best during these times were not necessarily the wealthiest, but rather individuals deeply integrated into robust local networks. The isolated individual with funds in a bank account faced destitution, while the connected individual with strong relationships thrived. In Argentina, in 2001, as banks closed, neighborhood assemblies emerged. People organized at a local level to barter, share resources, and establish security measures. These informal networks became more vital than governmental structures. Individuals embedded within these networks could exchange their skills for food or their labor for goods. Consider Lebanon from 2019 to the present. The Lebanese pound has lost 90% of its value. Banks have closed, and the government has become largely dysfunctional. Yet Lebanon has not descended into widespread chaos. The reason? Lebanon is structured around extensive family and religious community networks. These networks provide what the government cannot. Prior to the advent of modern institutions, all economic activity transacted through networks of trust. Transactions were conducted with individuals known and vouched for. Loans were extended to those with a demonstrated history of repayment. Modern institutions have enabled large-scale operations that extend beyond local trust. However, when these institutions fail, a reversion to trust-based networks occurs. In America in 2025, the majority of people are institutionally connected but locally isolated. You may have a bank account, yet remain unacquainted with your neighbors. You depend on large retail chains for your food supply, but may not know local farmers. You rely on law enforcement for security, but may not know your immediate community. This situation is inherently fragile. When institutions fail, there is no fallback system. Cultivate local networks now. Familiarize yourself with your neighbors. Develop reciprocal relationships. Integrate yourself into a community. As institutional trust erodes, local trust gains increasing significance. The individual possessing strong local networks will endure. The isolated individual will face considerable challenges. These are the 5 foundational principles. Tangible assets persist while paper is consumed. Prioritize ownership of productive assets over speculative ones. Debt becomes a liability in times of collapse. Skills are your transferable wealth. Local networks outlast institutional structures. Observe what is conspicuously absent from this enumeration. specific stock recommendations, which cryptocurrency to acquire, or whether gold or silver is the superior choice. These are tactical considerations. The principles, conversely, are universally applicable. They were effective in Rome. They were effective in Weimar. They will be effective in America. The elegance of principles lies in their independence from precise timing. You are not required to ascertain the exact moment of collapse. You position yourself in accordance with principles that are inherently resilient to crisis. Acquire tangible assets rather than paper instruments. The collapse might occur in 2030 or 2040. It is of little consequence. Tangible assets preserve wealth during both periods of stability and periods of adversity. Own productive assets. If the system remains stable, productive assets generate income. If it falters, you possess the means of production. Eliminate debt. During stable times, this provides resilience. In a collapse, it ensures survival. While debtors lose everything, you must cultivate skills. In stable times, skills augment income. In a collapse, skills transform into your sole portable asset. Build local networks. During stable times, these foster community. In a collapse, they become your survival infrastructure. These principles enhance your life in the present and offer protection for the future. The common error individuals make is awaiting absolute certainty. They desire to know the precise timing of a collapse. However, collapses do not issue advance warnings. By the time their inevitability is apparent, it is invariably too late. The brilliance of adhering to principles is that they bypass the need for prediction. You position yourself according to what endures collapse, thereby ensuring protection regardless of the temporal aspect. These 5 principles are ancient, having endured for 3,000 years because they represent fundamental truths applicable to every economic system, from the Roman Empire through medieval Europe, the Industrial Revolution, and into modern America. The principles remain unchanged because human nature is constant and the laws of mathematics are immutable. When debt surpasses the capacity for repayment, collapse is inevitable. When currency is debased, paper wealth disintegrates. When institutions fail, local networks assume paramount importance. These are not speculative prophecies. They are recurring patterns that have manifested hundreds of times. The impending collapse in America will undoubtedly follow these same established patterns. While the tactical approaches employed this time may be specific to our present circumstances, the underlying principles will remain constant. Tangible assets endure. Productive assets generate value. Debt is destructive. Skills are portable. Local networks supersede institutions. Align your positioning with these principles now, and you will navigate what lies ahead. Disregard them and pursue fleeting tactics, and you are gambling on your ability to perfectly time the collapse, a bet that most individuals invariably lose. If this has illuminated the superiority of principles over tactics, demonstrated that the same 5 principles have weathered every historical collapse, and shown that you can position yourself effectively without requiring precise temporal foresight, please subscribe. The subsequent video will detail the specific tactics congruent with these principles for the context of 2025 America. Which tangible assets hold merit in a digital economy? Which productive assets generate value in contemporary markets? How can debt be strategically eliminated? Which skills are most in demand? And how can local networks be fostered within an increasingly isolated society? The principles will inform you of what to do. The tactics will elucidate how to do it. These 5 principles were effective in Rome, in Weimar, in Argentina, and in every collapse since. They will be effective in America. The sole determinant is whether you will embrace them before the opportunity window closes, or whether you will lament your inaction thereafter.